Afternoon. This is Chuck Morse. Welcome to the show. And I'm joined by Scott Lively. He is a candidate for governor. We're running as a Republican this time as for governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Scott, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be with you, Chuck.
Scott, just as a little background, you ran last time as an independent. You made some real waves. You debated the candidates. You brought up conservative issues and forced the media to cover those because they have to as a candidate. Now you're running in the Republican primary. You're taking on a sitting Republican governor, that being Charlie Baker. Talk a little bit about the previous campaign and how this campaign is a little bit different.
Well, in 2014, I was in the midst of running inner city Michigan in Springfield, Massachusetts. The hat that I was wearing at that time was as a pastor and a missionary, which I am. And my goal was simply to interject biblical values and perspectives back into the Massachusetts political arena. I'm an 11th generation Bay Stater. I go back to Roger Conant, who was the founder and first governor of Salem. I grew up in Shelburne Falls. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts is my home and has been for a long time, and I am appalled at what's happened. But in 2014, my purpose was only to remind everyone that this Commonwealth rests on a biblical foundation. And the founders, the Constitution, they all echo that common refrain. And I think I was successful in doing that, but I had no interest in winning. I told people I didn't want to win, as a way to actually bring attention to the fact that the ideas were more important.
But this time around, you were in it to win. And
right.
Your success, to the degree that you do well, and maybe you very well may win, I hope you do, but whether you do or not, if you do well, that's going to have the equivalent of a political earthquake.
Yes. This time, the hat that I'm wearing.
Yep.
This time, the hat that I'm wearing is a constitutional law attorney, which I am, and a political analyst, which I am, and I'm running because Mr. Baker has been even a bigger disappointment than I expected that he would be, and he has moved the state dramatically to the left when we thought that at least he'd hold the line, but he hasn't done that. He's moved us to the left. And that really he's proved himself to be just the third in line of the axis of weasels, I call it, that began with William Weld. And he's really the culmination of this strategy of pandering to the left, abandoning conservatism, and just solely to have power and control over the treasury for his cronies.
I mean, it's what we might call a Me Too Republican. It's just kind of going along to get along. Once in a while, he'll throw a bone to conservatives, but for the most part, he's governing, I would describe, left of center. And
I think it's worse than that, Chuck. I think he's actually leading no Democrat governor was able to accomplish against the Second Amendment what Mr. Baker's done. He's actually introduced confiscation, right? With the bump stock law. That's the introduction of confiscation as a legal principle in addressing Second Amendment issues. The left couldn't get away with that. Deval Patrick couldn't have gotten away with that. It's sort of like Nixon going to China. It's in the political mentality, and on the abortion issue, he's included in his 2019 budget $1.6 million for Planned Parenthood in case they lose money from Congress because of their involvement in their alleged quote unquote involvement in that illegal baby parts harvesting and marketing that is so outrageous and abominable. Right. And Baker took money from them after this had happened and promised them to replace funding to them after these things happen. This isn't just a Me Too. This is let me get to the head of the parade and lead liberalism, lead the Republicans into liberalism along with the Democrats.
You know, I was pleased to find out that Massachusetts is one of only 14 states nationally that permits teachers to carry concealed weapons. with permission from the local school board, which, and by the way, Florida was not one of those states.
Yes.
And which, Massachusetts is actually a pretty solid gun state. And we have a long tradition of that, especially your part of the state, Western Mass. As far as abortion, it's one thing to be pro-choice, but it sounds like Baker is actually providing taxpayer funds to support abortion, which is something that's not legal nationally, the Mexican rule, and yet states do have the prerogative, I suppose, of doing it, although that's constitutionally questionable. But it's an option and it's a prerogative that apparently he's taking. So I think that's a great issue for you to raise.
He also took a travel junket with a bunch of his financial supporters that includes the head of one of the abortion facilities in Boston. This isn't just pro-choice. This is abortion advocacy.
It's actually pro-abortion. I mean, they're actually actively promoting Planned Parenthood, which is the largest abortion provider in the state. Yeah. And they have this phony business with the double books. This money goes only for non-abortion. Right. That's a lot of garbage.
Like Trump, like Mr. Trump is fond of saying, the people get it. Anybody who has their eyes open and who cares about ethics and morality, they get it. They know what's going on.
All right, my guest is Scott Lively. He's a candidate for governor of Massachusetts. Scott, one of your major issues, and I think it's one that resonates with most people in this state, even many liberals, is education. You've come out against this kind of nationalizing of our education system with the Common Core in one of the most disgraceful and bizarre public policies that I've seen come down the pike in the history of this state in my lifetime. Governor Deval Patrick took a state education system, which was very good for the most part. We can criticize things of it, of course, but which had worked hard to become better. And he sold it out to the Common Core. He nationalized it, lowered our standards, hurt students. My daughter at the time was a public school student, and I remember some of the teachers told me, I mean, both in the class when we went to Parents' Day and otherwise, how horrible this was, that we threw out our public education system virtually and replaced it with this inane, internationally based Common Core, which leads to all of the very social problems that we can discuss. It strips away a young person's ability to think cognitively, instead it replaces it with behaviorism. What would you do as governor of Massachusetts to restore our public education standards?
Well, I call it Commie Core myself, because this is straight out of the Communist Party handbook. A lot of the Soviet Union was doing this kind of stuff in the 1920s. And we should have learned from that, but we don't, because our public education system is in the control of public employee unions, which are thoroughly Marxist. And that's where all this stuff is coming from. It's from the United Nations that comes down layer after layer down to the states, and it's being implemented as if it's something locally derived. It's not. This is international, as you pointed out. What I would do, this is the same approach I would take with everything, is I want to go back to the original vision of the Commonwealth that the founders established. This is bottom-up government, not top-down. That's the big distinction. A constitutional republic, as it was envisioned by the founders, is bottom-up. The people have the control, that the things are controlled locally as much as possible, and you only defer up the line to a higher, more distant level of government on things that are necessary or it's more appropriate. So on things like education belongs in the home. I think the number one format for education should be the homeschool. That charter school should be secondary to that. That the institutionalized government system that we have right now it's a leftist Marxist model. And even the size of the school districts and the schools, the local school systems, are designed for maximum groupthink in the minds of the students, and it's directly contradictory to what we're supposed to be. We've lost our self-sufficiency as a people. We've lost our sense of individuality. Right? all the left talks about individuality and individualism all the time, but really it's exactly the opposite. They're producing groupthink in all of our kids, and I would reverse that in education. I would reverse that in the economy. I would shift the flow of revenue from our tax base through the local government up toward the state government instead of top down, because whoever's got control of the money has control of the government. And that should be the people themselves with as much direct hands-on control as they can have, so they can actually scrutinize all of the policies that their children and their homes, their lives, their community are subject to, and be able to change them rapidly. Right? This idea of long, drawn-out, legislative process where lobbyists have more influence than the people do. That's got to change.
Scott, as someone who's a pastor and as a constitutional lawyer, you have a pretty solid understanding of the proper role of a state government versus federal government, that natural system of checks and balances that's codified in the 9th and 10th Amendments of the Constitution. And that's something that it's going to require a bit of education for people to realize the nature of that. You actually understand the proper role of a governor and the proper role of legislators and city and town and community governments. And I think that on a positive sense, putting aside the question of homeschooling, your candidacy and your governorship would reinvigorate local public schools, because they would once again be under the control of local school boards.
Yeah, I'm not against public schools. Don't get me wrong. I'm not against them. I'm for them. But I'm for them being under the control of the local community, not some distant state or federal bureaucracy.
Or international bureaucracy. The local school board is where you elect people whose sons and daughters go to the school, who have a stake in the game, who understand what's going on inside the school. And they, in a sense, this almost capsulizes the very essence of the conservative idea, which is that we trust individuals. We trust the people to understand how to govern themselves and how to
Chuck,
govern their own lives.
The shooting that just took place in Parkland, Florida, right? That could never have happened in a locally controlled school district, right? This kid was trouble for a long time. That if this was a school district that was controlled locally and all the parents were involved, then they would have gotten help for this kid long before anything like this ever came on the radar. But because they don't have any control, who has control of that school district? It's the teachers union that has control of that school district, and the federal education department, where all the money comes from. All that should be reversed. Here in Massachusetts, almost a third of our budget comes from the federal government. I think that's atrocious. I think that gives almost all of the control over our policy over to the feds, which is why it operates that way. We should be self-sufficient. Massachusetts we need to rebuild our factories, get our manufacturing base reestablished, cut all the waste, the fraud, and the abuse out of the state government, put control back in the hands of the citizens, and then we will be able to get to a place where we not only have paid off our $148 billion debt, but we will have a surplus, and we won't need to take money from the federal government, and we won't have to dance to their tune on all of their rotten Marxist policies.
Yeah, the federal government takes money out of your pocket, sends it to Washington, and then they give it back to the state with strings attached.
Exactly.
It's a program that goes back to really started accelerating in the 1960s.
How different is that from King George, right?
Well, no, absolutely, I totally agree. It's tyranny.
This is the taxing without representation state. And why? Because all of our money was going back to King George.
And it's government by transfer of powers from elected officials like governors and representatives to these unelected, faceless bureaucrats who in many cases aren't even Americans. It's as in the case of Common Core. We've lost control of our ability
all along the way.
Yeah, we've lost control of our ability to govern ourselves. We've to control what our children are taught and other aspects. And you mentioned like the Parkland shooting. it is a classic example of the failure of big government when you get down to it. I mean, it was a situation that easily could have been handled on a local level. Everyone knew what was going on. Even this kid himself called the police and said, "I'm about to shoot someone," and nothing was done. It's just, it would be almost, quaint to call it incompetence. It was more of a systemic problem, and like any other systemic
negligence,
problem,
really. It's what it is. It's misfeasance, right? Is what it is. It's malfeasance is when there's an intentional breach of the law by a public official. Misfeasance, an old common law term that's perfectly valid today, is when incompetence and negligence are the order of the government that produces bad results. And that misfeasance is probably more common than malfeasance, but they're both endemic in both the federal and the state bureaucracies. And all that can be avoided by just getting back to doing things the ways that the founders intended, which is so much less expensive to do it the way that they put it together.
And it's also there's a lot more common sense in people of our state, and for that matter, other states dealing with their own unique problems, handling our problems in our own neighborhood where we do know best. We are capable of self-government. We don't need the great administrator coming in from outside. Now, Scott, you also are addressing a very serious problem plaguing this state and the nation, and that is the opioid epidemic. You have some very practical solutions to that problem that don't necessarily, or they don't, need to have the federal government spending trillions of dollars on who knows what, who's getting paid what, and how much. It has more to do with actually handling this situation locally in a way that helps people and that gets people off of their addictions. Talk about that.
Well, first of all, people should know that I was a drug addict and an alcoholic myself. I became an alcoholic at the age of 12. My father was very mentally ill. I retreated into alcoholism. I started smoking pot at 14, and then I started taking every other kind of drug. I took opioids. I never shot them. But I was a full-blown alcoholic and a drug addict. I used to sleep under bridges. I hitchhiked all over the United States. And, I know what it's like to be an addict. And I know from the inside, from that other side of the street, what it's like to be in bondage to the government. Because really what this is about, this so-called opioid epidemic, this is deliberate enslavement of human beings in order to establish an income stream to state slush funds from the federal government. That's what so much of what the social justice warriors are talking about with their sanctimonious, I'm more moral than you are in caring for the poor. It's all lies. A lot of the people at the bottom, they're well-intentioned, but the people at the top, it's all about establishing control in government dependency of people with various kinds of problems. Each one of them becomes an income stream from the federal government through grants and other money into the pockets of the state. Now, not always directly into people's hands, although there is some graft and skimming. But all they really need to do is it just pours into a state fund that the Democrats mostly, but Baker people now too, have control of, and then they just simply expand the number of people in the public employee unions who are all going to vote socialist forever, and nothing is ever done. They don't want to deliver people from heroin addiction. They want them on methadone for their lives.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically this entire cottage industry of social workers and various other types who have built up around the very human miseries that they tend to perpetrate and promote. I know that sounds...
Section 8 housing, all the people that own the Section 8 housing.
We could look at housing. We could look at all of these things. I mean, these are industries. I mean, I don't mean to sound punitive here. I think that there are well-meaning people out there who are doing this kind of work, but, it's... I
do too. It's not a blanket condemnation.
No, I mean, these are industries that grow up around these problems, so they have a self-interest in keeping these problems around. Now, you have a pretty practical solution because what you're talking about is the problem, but yet the real problem is the guy on the street that I see over in Mass Ave here in Boston waiting outside a methadone clinic who's wandering around the street who are probably going to get hit by a car. What do we do for those people? I mean, I want to see something done that can help get those people, sober and clean and off the street.
Well, one of my good friends is Dr. Kishore. Dr. Kishore, who is the creator of what was called the Massachusetts Miracle.
Yeah.
He had a sort of natural approach to delivering people from heroin opioid addiction that involved an initial sort of pharmaceutical remedy, non-opioid pharmaceutical remedy through the withdrawal phase, and then a holistic, multifaceted reestablishment of their lives and grounding of their lives in family, community, and healthy alternatives to what they'd done before. It had a 37% success rate, right? It was phenomenally good, but it was encroaching on the profits of the people running the drug labs and the and these state slush funds. And so Martha Coakley came in and they basically stole $100 million company that Dr. Kishore had built up, not for his own pockets. This was done with altruism, and it was saving people and delivering them. And I learned about it. I was running an inner city mission at the time. That mission, I'm still involved. The leadership has turned over to others that we raised up during our 7-year campaign to launch it. But these are the people I was working with on the streets. And so when I saw Dr. Kishore come along with this, it was so refreshing. But they took him down, and they replaced the Massachusetts Miracle with methadone mile, in which there's a less than 2% success rate, which is like accidental recovery. It would be higher than that. They're deliberately keeping people enslaved to methadone for the money. And if I were to become governor, if by God's grace I became governor of Massachusetts, I would establish Dr. Kishore's model border to border. We would turn this situation around. And I think there's even more that can be done even than he was doing, but he was just one man. But we certainly wouldn't continue to perpetuate this egregious scam called the opioid epidemic, which is it's organized crime merged with government. That's what's going on here. And while I'm on that tack, just look around. What are the two most recent industries that Massachusetts has imported in order to deal with our atrocious economic problems? Gambling casinos and drug sales. Like, where does that come from? That comes from organized crime. It's like the Godfather. And yet that's what our government now has instituted as economic policy. It's unbelievable. I would reverse that.
And that's what you're up against. And these are very, very powerful forces.
That's right.
Scott,
but there's no more powerful force than Almighty God. And that's who I serve. I'm a Christian pastor. The founders came from a Judeo-Christian worldview. That Jews and Christians who stood on the Bible acknowledged it as true and designed a society based upon it, and by doing so produced the most secure and prosperous nation in the history of the world, until the Marxists infiltrated it and started taking all the institutions into their own hands. And now what we've got is the poisonous fruit of their tree.
And for you to introduce this idea in Massachusetts is a big uphill climb, because they've been in control of the cultural high ground for so long that the parents of the children who are being indoctrinated, they themselves had been indoctrinated.
They're in favor of the poison that's killing their own children.
Yeah, because they were themselves poisoned by it, and it's almost an institutional dilemma to overcome it, but it can be done, and you're certainly doing a yeoman's job in terms of doing it.
What the most important role of a governor, and I want to make the distinction between a politician and a statesman. I am not a politician. A politician panders. A politician says what people want to hear in order to get elected. A statesman says what they need to hear in order to solve the problems. Why do you put a governor in place if all you do is expect them to just follow your whims? You put a governor in place because they know better than the average person how to change things and make it better. That's what a statesman does. He tells people what they need to hear. I'm under no illusions here about what would happen if I were elected, right? I would be up against a leftist, even worse than what Mr. Trump has faced in Washington, D.C. Massachusetts is more corrupt than D.C. is in many ways. But what Mr. Trump has shown in a model, and what I understand inherently, is that what's most important is that the bully pulpit, to be able to stand up there as the highest political office in the Commonwealth and to speak plain truth that can't be censored by the media, that goes over the tops of all the gatekeepers right to the people and explains why conservatism is better than liberalism and how it can solve the problems. They can't stop that. Then in the next election cycle, you raise up people who will rally to that message, and you start to replace the legislators that have been in there with their hands in everybody's pocket all this time with good people, so that by the end of your first term, you actually have the within reach the ability to restore some of the conservatism that you can't do it day one, but you can tell the truth from day one.
That's right, and that, Scott, by your stepping up to the bat, you are inspiring other people to warm up and step up as well. And, it has a contagious effect. I think that President Donald Trump is having the same phenomena on a national level. Now, your enemies, the left, the establishment in this state, the main line of attack against you is that you've got something against gay men and women. You went to Uganda. I don't know quite what happened. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. But there was I think they tried to draw a connection between your going there and delivering a speech. And
you can't listen to anything that they say. Well, these people are liars.
I'm glad I had to clarify this because the whole story sounded a little hinky to me. So
well, look here. Let me just put it in perspective. Let's just put this in perspective. Rather than getting off in the weeds about the specific allegations and all that, just get a sense of where we're really at in this country. Billy Graham died the other day, right? A man who lived almost a century. His entire adult life was devoted to altruism, for caring for other people. He was a gentle soul who barely spoke against homosexuality. And when he did, it was just simply citing the scriptures and saying he agreed with them. In fact, those of us who are Christian social activists were really not very happy with him because he never used his authority to sort of help us in recovering from all the damage that was being done to the family. And yet when he died, this poison-tongued young woman from Teen Vogue tweeted the most abominable language about Billy Graham, that hoping that he burns in hell and that he was a piece of you-know-what while he was alive, and all of it justified in her mind just simply because he was quote-unquote homophobic. Now, that is the mentality of the social justice millennials, right? They have a hatred of people who simply coming from a traditional view or a biblical view that marriage is something that it's a God-ordained institution for men and women. And everything works better when you follow that. And so if they can do that to Billy Graham, imagine what extent they will engage in dirty tricks and propaganda and lies against somebody like me who actually effectively opposes their political agenda.
No,
that's all you really need to know.
No, it's a very fascistic and scary group that does not work any opposition. And look, I think it's fair to say that yourself and other conservatives, we respect the rights homosexuals or anyone else have rights under the law. No one is saying
Sure.
they don't.
I'm a constitutional law attorney. I have credentials in international human rights that I earned in Strasbourg in a United Nations program. I'm no fan of the United Nations, but I actually lived for part of a summer at the University of Strasbourg and studied this. I have consulted on international human rights around the world. And I can tell you, there is no human right based in sodomy, but human rights based in marriage and family values, they go back 4,000 years, before even the Old Testament was written. And so, but by the same token, basic civil rights belong to everyone, and I've always supported that. The two things that I would do in Massachusetts that I think really represent my heart and I think would help to restore a little bit of balance here. Number one is what I call the First Amendment Supremacy Clause. This is something I drafted for use by companies and governments wherever there's a sexual orientation regulations based on sexual orientation. It just simply says whenever there's a conflict between these regulations and the First Amendment has to prevail. It has to prevail. You cannot have newly invented laws and policies superseding the most fundamental right of Americans. So that's one policy. The second is what I call the separation of LGBT and state. And to the extent that that religion is restricted in government, so should the LGBT political movement, because it's basically the counter to it. It's their opposite political forces and movements competing for influence in the society. The government should get his thumb off the scale when it comes to that. And let's get back to like we had in the 40s and 50s, which is respect for privacy, that people can do whatever they want to, the privacy of their bedroom, as long as it's not messing with kids or something, and that we leave that alone. That's a subculture, but the mainstream culture it protects the natural family, which is really the ecosystem of humanity. And I think that's very reasonable. I think most people would agree with that.
Having said that, however, as governor, you'll recognize without condoning, but you'll recognize the existence of gay marriage.
Well, that's right. Unfortunately, we're sort of stuck with that at this time. I don't see that changing. We have two Supreme Court justices who actually violated the most fundamental judicial ethics that exist in order to vote and put that in place. But it's not going to be reversed without a Supreme Court ruling. I don't see that happening. So I've shifted my emphasis from trying to overturn gay marriage to simply preserving the natural family. I've taken more of an ecological approach, that the natural family is the ecosystem of humanity, and we can't allow that model to be just simply steamrolled over as if it's not important. Our laws have to protect people who prefer the natural family, a man and a woman raising children together. Regardless of what's happening in the larger society, we need to have a protection. We need to have a conservationist mentality toward the natural family, and that's the sort of new paradigm that I will be introducing during this election cycle, and I think it would fit very well in Massachusetts, and that there's some the coexistence that can happen between people who have different perspectives with that kind of an approach.
Very well put. We're reaching towards the end of the program, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the practical matters of running for office, because I want to see you do well. What is your ground game? What's the horse race question? How are you organizing in this state, and what are you doing to create the necessary political organization that can compete and win?
Well, first of all, I'm very much a grassroots-oriented guy. I've been involved in political grassroots since 1988, and I know that that's actually more powerful, more important than money in politics. If you don't have the people, the money doesn't matter. And we saw what our friend in was it Virginia, right? Did with Eric Cantor. And I think that that's potential here in Massachusetts. My job one is to get a minimum of 15% of the Republican delegates at the convention, and that's the only way you can get on the Republican primary ballot. In the 2010 and the 2014 elections, the Baker team cheated in order to keep first Christy Mijos and then Mark Fisher off the ballot. Because of what happened in 2010, the conservatives were prepared, and our friend Brian Kamaker actually videotaped the cheating that took place in 2014.
I remember that, sure.
And as a result of that, they were not able to get away with it. And even though they did their best to keep him off the ballot, a judge put him back on. Well, actually, no, a settlement. They agreed in a settlement to put him back on, and ended up paying over $400,000 between attorney fees and a $250,000 settlement to Mr. Fisher because of that cheating. Now, this time, they've started early on the cheating process. By last week, the executive committee voting to repeal the neutrality rules, long-standing neutrality rules, that forbid the party from favoring one candidate over another in the primary. And they did that, it was in the Boston Globe. It's a big deal. In response to that, I filed a criminal complaint with the Attorney General, and I'm alleging both misdemeanor and felony violations of Massachusetts election law in that collusion between Mr. Baker and the Mass GOP Executive Committee. So they started early on the process. But I believe that I can get 15% of the delegates. I think there's still enough concern. And remember what Baker did in 2016. Even after what he did to Mark Fisher, everybody held their nose and voted for him because, sort of like the Trump-Clinton contest, the idea of Martha Coakley in there it would have been as bad as Hillary Clinton, almost as bad. And so everybody held their nose, voted for Mr. Baker, hoping that he would actually move a little bit more to the right. And of course he didn't. And not only did he not only thank the conservatives for putting him in there, in 2016 he raised about $1 million in so-called dark money from undisclosed donors, which is actually probably Mr. Romney and his cronies, in order to try to a coup, a Soviet-style coup, to take out the conservatives out of the state committee, and succeeded much less than he hoped, but he did improve his position. And but anyway, Baker has been at war with the conservatives since he first set eyes on the governor's seat, and he's not going to stop now. But I think that I can overcome him by just speaking plain truth to people who still remember it in their hearts. The conservatives still know what true conservatism, true republicanism looks like. And as long as they have a reminder of that, and that's why there has to be a contested primary, as the only way that the Massachusetts electorate is ever going to change things is if someone articulates authentic conservatism to them, which they haven't heard since William Weld got in. Right. So, yeah.
Are you working with any slate of conservative candidates for, the legislature around the state?
Well, I am. I actually believe in the neutrality policy, and I'm not going to tip my hand regarding. I do favor people in different races, but I want to give the electorate, the delegates, an opportunity to pick who they like, and I'm not getting into that. I'm laser focused on the convention. I'm not even doing very much in the way of media. It's just the idea of just reaching the delegates, finding the conservatives, encouraging them not to listen to Mr. Baker's, promises and threats, and instead just vote their conscience, vote their values in the convention. And if that happens, we'll have a real contested primary in which Baker's liberalism and my conservatism can be put foursquare in front of all the Republicans and the independents, and I think people are going to be surprised at the result of that.
going to be a choice and not an echo, as the late
Exactly.
Phyllis Schlafly said in her famous book.
Great woman. I had the privilege of being friends with Phyllis.
And I had interviewed her many times. I've always admired her. Scott, I want you to let the viewers and listeners know how they can reach you, how they can contribute, how they can get involved.
Well, the best way is just to email me. You can email me directly. I read all my own emails. VoteLively@gmail.com. Real simple. VoteLively@gmail.com. And then our campaign website is livelyforgovernor.us. You got to remember it's the US, not .com. Somebody stole my my name last election, a guy in India. And I can't get it back. But
pay a lot of money, I'm sure.
yeah. So livelyforgovernor.us and votelively@gmail.com. And I'd love to connect with anybody who agrees that that true conservatism can restore Massachusetts to greatness.
It's a great, simple message. I'm looking forward to having you back from time to time, and as the campaign progresses, Scott. And I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you, Chuck. God bless you, and God bless all your listeners.
And God bless you. Thanks so much.